Welcome back, everybody, to part 2 of our interwar period 3-part series. Today we're going to focus on the state of Nazi Germany and their expansionist kind of how Hitler comes to power, how he chooses to consolidate that power and march throughout Europe. So I'm just going to present this for you so that you can see it. All right, so the rise of totalitarianism in Germany. Remember, this is, if you are using the guided note taker, this is in that one single document. Okay. So if you recall from the end of the First World War, right, the immediate aftermath of the war, Germany actually had, at that time, kind of a modern, liberal, democratic political system. And that was called the Weimar Republic. And they were not in power during the First World War. They come to power at the end of the war, and they are the government that is forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles. They were not the perpetrators of the war, but they are the ones being forced to take responsibility for it. So, quick recap from the Treaty of Versailles. I'm not going to read all of this to you, right? Just some of the highlights, right? So there is disarmament in terms of volume of soldiers they can have, disarmament in terms of types of war machines they can have, in terms of the Navy as well as the infantry. There are land losses, right, in terms of colonies and land in Europe. They have to demilitarize. They can't join with Austria. They are forced to recognize successor states like Czechoslovakia and Poland, and then, of course, sign that war guilt clause. And that is a big one, Article 231, which places the blame on Germany for the war. In addition to this, right, they are also forced to pay $33 billion American, and in 1919, this is a lot of money, in war reparations. And like I mentioned in our last episode, they actually stopped paying this in 2010. So the Weimar Republic, right, that liberal democratic government that Germany had in the immediate aftermath of the war, the First World War, basically, right, they were in shambles. They were trying to pick up the pieces of this war, and a lot of people felt that the Weimar Republic, or this democratic government, didn't provide Germans with enough hope. So they started to turn to other options. Now, this is pushing down the line, late 20s, early 30s, right? This is not, this Treaty of Versailles in 1919 and then in 1920, right? They're not happy. This is taking some time. So Hitler comes onto the scene. He starts to capitalize on the fears of Germans, right? On their he turns the tide, basically, right? He is going to try to blame somebody, right? Ultimately the Jews, in order to kind of transition people's mindsets. So he capitalizes on fears, and his Nazi party eventually, right, as it slowly gets members elected into government, right, they do have about 1/3 of the seats come the early 1930s. His Nazi party promotes this idea of extreme nationalism or ultranationalism or absolute nationalism as listed here, which calls for the unification of all German speakers. Because remember, the Treaty of Versailles kind of split Germany up a little bit, right? They have to give up land to Poland. They have to give Alsace-Lorraine back to France. They cannot join with Austria, and Austria has a lot of native German speakers. They have to give up land to Czechoslovakia. So you've got German speakers now in 4 neighboring countries. Okay? And Hitler uses ultranationalism, calling for the reunification of all of those speakers. He uses paramilitary organizations to kind of root out the opposition, squash opposition, squash dissent, right? So that idea of threat, coercion, in order to suppress the opposition. Okay. Centralized decision making into a single leader. We talked about this yesterday of why dictatorships in terms of fascism require a single leader. And one of the things that the Nazis really advocated for was their version and their vision of law and order. And in a period of time that was very unstable, right, politically and economically, this idea of law and order, after years of instability, appealed to a lot of people. As we mentioned the other day, Hitler's fascism and Hitler's Nazism had theories of racial superiority built within it. And we're going to be focusing on the results of this next week when we talk about the Holocaust. Ultimately speaking, Nazi ideology was centered around the theory that the Germans formed a superior race, or what was known as the Aryan race. And Hitler was going to use the Jews as a scapegoat, saying that the Jews were the cause of many of Germany's problems. But what's interesting is anti-Semitism was not unique to Germany. Anti-Semitism has been around for centuries. Hitler's really going to capitalize on it, use the Jews as a scapegoat to further his own national interest. I shouldn't say national interest, self-interest. And we'll focus on those ideas of anti-Semitism next week when we get into talking about the Holocaust. So how does Hitler go from being a backbencher in the opposition to basically the dictator within a very short amount of time? So there's a series of laws during this time period in Germany that he finds the loopholes in order to consolidate power. And one of those things was called Article 48 of the Constitution of the Weimar government. Okay, so the Weimar government lasts from 1919 to 1933. So it's around for about 14 years. Okay, and the government has a president and a chancellor. And this is still the same in Germany, where the chancellor is the face of the country and the president is more figureheadish. Okay? So around this time, so the president, under various circumstances, was able to take emergency measures without consent of the Reichstag. That was what their government, kind of their house, we call it the House of Commons, they called it the Reichstag. The Article 48 allowed the president to make emergency decrees. Okay, and the problem was that during this 1919 to 1933 time period, the German president used this way too frequently. Whenever there was a deadlock in the Reichstag, right, or their house, right, they couldn't come to agreement, they couldn't pass anything. Instead of just talking it all through, the president would use powers. He would invoke Article 48, use the decree power to make a decision. But the problem with this is that chancellors then were no longer responsible to the Reichstag, where all of the other representatives were. And so what you see as a result of the excessive use of these emergency decrees is a loss in confidence in constitutional democracy because it's being abused. So how does Hitler consolidate his power? Now, what a lot of people don't necessarily recognize is that Hitler was elected to government. He did use paramilitary organizations and all of that to get there, but he was technically elected, and used technically very loosely. And so by November of 1932, the Nazi Party led by Hitler had about 1/3 of the seats in the Reichstag. Okay, so in their government. And by 1933, Hitler gets named chancellor. How do you go from being, a backbencher member of the opposition, right, leader of one of the many opposition parties, to now all of a sudden you are chancellor of the country? And so he capitalizes on the very rapidly changing situation in order to turn Germany into into a totalitarian state. And he uses a fire in the Reichstag. And a lot of historians believe that this fire was actually staged by the Nazis, and then they used propaganda in terms of fear of communism in order to consolidate power. Um, and so this fire occurs, and it essentially the Nazis are going to blame it on the communists in order to spread fear of a communist takeover. Because if there's anything people hate more than any other type of kind of political system at this time, is they really fear communism. And so the Nazis, like I mentioned, it's widely believed that they actually started this fire. So Hitler is chancellor. Okay, once chancellor, Hitler forms a coalition with the nationalists, right? Because he still doesn't have enough power, right? Although he's been named chancellor, he doesn't have support of everybody yet. So he forms a coalition. So he joins up with another political party through fear and intimidation, and calls for elections on March the 5th. 6 days before the election, on February 27th, is this fire, right? As mentioned on the previous slide, he convinces the people that this was the first step in a communist revolution, and he kind of sets the pretext to convince President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree by using that Article 48 that we just talked about in order to further Hitler's plans, right? So he convinces President Hindenburg to sign this emergency power. What does this emergency power do? It's technically labeled the Presidential Decree for the Protection of the People and the State. However, under this decree, this emergency decree on the basis of Article 48, basically this gave the government the authority to suspend the rights and freedoms of people. Basically, their version of Canada's War Measures Act, just taken to a further extreme. Bans freedom of expression, bans freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, privacy in terms of your post, your phone, any form of communication. So essentially, that Reichstag fire decree was one of the first steps the Nazis took to establish a totalitarian dictatorship in Germany. So there's a little summary there. All of the things that it made it possible for the Nazis to do. Restrict individual rights and freedoms. Eliminate privacy of communication. Eliminate the need for warrants to conduct searches. Pass legislation through the office of the Chancellor without approval of the Reichstag. And that's a big one, right? Because that means that Hitler is not accountable to the Reichstag. And that Reichstag was, in theory, supposed to be accountable to the people. So now you have the elimination of any form of accountability to government and to the people, right? That is a big one. And this Reichstag fire decree goes one step further by also banning all political parties except the Nazi Party itself. So it has completely eliminated the opposition. And if you recall from the other day, the elimination of the opposition in a dictatorship is essential because you cannot have imposing ideas challenging the status quo, because that will lead to the destruction of your dictatorship. Now, we see a few more laws. So we have the Enabling Act. We have the Enabling Act that we're talking about right now. We have Article 48. We had the Reichstag Fire Decree. And now we have the Enabling Act. So by 1933, right, an amendment to the Constitution that gave German cabinet and Chancellor Adolf Hitler the power to enact laws without the involvement of the Reichstag. Okay, that was what this Enabling Act was. Basically, it's saying we don't have to be accountable to anybody. This is going to pass in the Reichstag and get signed by President von Hindenburg. Well, why are people signing this? Remember those paramilitary organizations, right? They're working behind the scenes to make sure that fear and coercion go a long way to make sure that everybody signs these laws, right? And votes for these laws. And remember, there's only a single party now in the Reichstag. If you're not in it, you're out. Now, this act said that this law was only going to last 4 years unless renewed by the Reichstag. Well, of course it's going to be renewed by the Reichstag. It's a single-party state. Naturally, this is going to happen 2 times. So this gives Hitler basically complete power of Germany, ultimately making him dictator of Germany, despite the fact that there is still a president. It's going to, as mentioned, it followed right on the heels of the Reichstag fire decree, which basically suspended civil liberties for people in Germany and transferred the state powers to this new government, or what Hitler calls the Third Reich government. Okay, so ultimately speaking, these 2 bills, the Reichstag fire decree and the Enabling Act, completely crushed the Weimar Republic. It is no more, and now you see the Third Reich come into power. Ultimately speaking, by 1933, Germany is a dictatorship. Okay? Opposition has been purged. President Hindenburg dies in 1934, and this is when Hitler declares himself the Führer, as he called himself. Right? You see individual rights and freedoms suffering tremendously, but all the while, Hitler is transitioning the economy and ramping it back up for war. So in 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed, right, when Hitler's kind of marching into power. 4 years later, in 1936, 5 million of those are back at work, and you only have 1 million that are unemployed. Well, how does he do this? He's revamping the military. He's undergoing massive public work projects in highways and train systems. Because if you're going to go to war and have this expansionist foreign policy, you need to be able to have mass numbers of troops that you can effectively move across the nation. He also bans foreign imports. Okay, they're restricted because he wants to basically make Germany self-sufficient and independent from other nations. So what you have by 1933, right, is very strict law and order, very false. Now, German in Hitler's mind, safe if you are Jewish, are mentally or physically disabled, if you are unemployed, if you are an alcoholic, or gay, or a whole host of other things. That security is not quite there for you. We see, as I mentioned on the previous slide, transportation improves in terms of a highway system and a massive train overhaul to the train system. And what you see is, in order to get all of this moving and people on board, rallies and propaganda, right? Hitler was a tremendous, horrible person, but he had a way of being when he spoke that managed to rally people behind his cause through manipulation. And it convinced the masses. Some, actually convinced, others convinced through fear. So fascism in Nazi Germany, right, had various elements. Nationalism here on the bottom, right, or ultranationalism as we call it in the context of your course, right, people working for the greater good in theory. Anti-liberal tendencies, right, because it's a totalitarian dictatorship, there are no liberal values left at all. Strong racism, right, anti-Semitism as a result of the Aryan race, like I said, we'll get into that next week. And this big business partnership, right, basically capitalism, but controlled capitalism, in that the state could dictate to you what you were producing and controlled who could work in industry and who couldn't, right? If you were Jewish, boycotts across the board, and then further steps to eliminate you later. Now, you've got to convince the masses that all of this is acceptable. So how does he do this? Well, when we look at women and youth, okay, women were basically, told to stay at home and to raise the children and have lots of them and raise good little Nazis, because later down the road, those good little Nazis would become the next generation of Nazi soldiers. Couples were rewarded for having children. They wanted you to have lots of them because they were going to need lots of young, able-bodied people down the road to further their expansionist policies. And so what he does is he creates a series of movements. So he creates the League of German Maidens, which was basically like his version of Girl Guides, but very much filled with propaganda. He also had a Boy Scout version. And I don't like to draw that comparison, Girl Guides and Boy Scouts necessarily, but it gives you an idea of kind of what a modern comparable might be. Obviously, those now teaching various life skills, then very much used for propaganda. And so you've got the League of German Maidens teaching young women how to be good housewives. You've got Hitler Youth, or the Hitler Youth, which was for boys, basically teaching them how to be, good little Nazis and survivors and militaristic kind of ideas and those types of things. So ultimately speaking, fascism rejects various parts of liberalism in that it's against democracy. It's against individual rights and freedoms. It rejects liberal political ideas. And these fascists saw liberal governments or democracies as unstable and weak and unable to solve the social and economic and political problems of the past. And so this is what kind of using propaganda opened the door to the emergence of the totalitarian state in Nazi Germany and in Mussolini's Italy. And that's where we're going to stop this one for today. Join us next time for lecture 3, looking at how we're going to march actually into World War II. So, hope you learned a little bit today. Hope you're staying safe and healthy. We'll see you next time.